Our format this evening is to have a presentation by our speaker, followed by a time for question and answers, then breakouts for small group discussion, and a brief wrap-up ending at 8:30 p.m. With Dr. Goggins' permission, tonight's presentation will be recorded. Note that we are only recording the presentation itself, not the question and answer period or the breakout sessions that follow. A link to the recording of the presentation will be placed on St. Hilary's website. During the presentation and the question and answer period that follow, I invite you to send your questions for our speaker to me, Sandy Selby, in the chat box, which you can reach by clicking on the word chat at the bottom of your screen. And I also understand that Dr. Goggins will be asking you to input into the chat at various times during his presentation. Our speaker, Lethardis Goggins II, Doctor of Education, has been an advocate for youth and education for more than 32 years and is the author of several books: Foundations, African-Centered Education, Bringing the Light into a New Day, African-Centered Rites of Passage, 365 Black, Nuggets of Wisdom for Each Day of the Year, and African-Centered Rites of Passage and Education, along with numerous articles. Professionally, Dr. Goggins has worked with at-risk youth as a prevention specialist, has worked more than 20 years in higher education as an admission counselor to associate dean to assistant professor. Dr. Goggins has also served as a middle school math and science teacher and currently works with Cleveland Metropolitan School District as a HumanWare social emotional learning partner. As a scholar, Dr. Goggins examines the relationships between socialization, identity development, learning, and academic achievement. Particularly, he uses the rites of passage model as a framework to better understand where students are in their development and what services and activities would be appropriate to promote achievement. Dr. Goggins' specializations include African American studies, trauma and learning, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. He is owner-publisher at St. Rest Publications and the principal consultant at Applied Academic Solutions. However, his greatest sense of accomplishment is being the proud dad of 4. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lethardis Goggins II to speak on the topic, The Path to Healing, Trauma's Impact on Learning. Welcome, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to share and discuss with you, and hopefully more discussion, and though there's a lot here. So I'll apologize up front. The scholar and geek in me was always trying to put 20 pounds of stuff in a 10-pound bag. And so it's going to be dense, but hopefully we'll have some conversation about this. And also want to thank the Interfaith Justice Alliance for putting on a series like this and hosting these kind of discussions, which quite frankly is much needed. And definitely, though we were supposed to do this last year, this in the interim year, clearly the need for this kind of discussions was made evident. So again, thank you. So tonight's discussion will be around trauma and learning. And I know that you've already heard a lot about trauma. And so we're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about trauma. What is trauma? Spend a moment talking about what cures trauma, and then some strategies to create healing-centered learning environments. So what is trauma? So this is going to be your first opportunity to put something into the chat. Just real quick, what comes to mind when you think of trauma? How would you define trauma? You just put that into the chat real quick. Situation that triggers your amygdala, okay. Intrusive thoughts, Depression, sure. anxiety, mhm, stress, violence, any type of physical, mental disturbance. Okay. Enduring pain, negative thoughts. Okay. All right. Something scary. All right. Keep all these things in mind. Excellent, excellent, excellent. So, startle response. Okay. Hypervigilance. Yes. All right. So, some examples of trauma. So, typically, when we ask this type of question, a lot of people come up with, some sense of abuse, sexual, emotional abuse, witness to a violence act, homelessness, residing with a parent or caretaker experiencing substance abuse, particularly we'll be talking about from the perspective of our students and our children. And these tend to be what we would call acute type events, that we are talking about a specific thing that had a great impact on our psyche that cause a harm at that moment, even when it's habitual, right? But we tend to think about these particular events. But another way of thinking about trauma, what some things that trigger trauma, are those chronic, or what's sometimes called complex traumas. And these can be things like poverty, particularly, where one lacks the fundamental material resources, necessities, and of course, historical oppression and disenfranchisement. While they may not necessarily create a moment in time or an acute pain at a particular day on a particular moment, the cumulative gnawing effect. Someone was talking about this idea of pain. We know sometimes that dull, nagging pain is far worse than that one-time acute, sharp pain, right? So when we are thinking about trauma, we want to expand our understanding of trauma to go beyond those moments or those incidences that we sometimes think about, particularly unfortunate situations that some of our students are dealing with, but also to include, not to substitute, but also to include the understanding of complex or chronic situations that are, in some cases, generational and that last years upon time, right? So in thinking about that, but here recently we've come across ACEs, which we call adverse childhood experiences, which has been a kind of a buzzword over the last few years. And so these have been categorized as you can see here. Now, this ACEs study was something that came out of a Kaiser Permanente study out of California in particular. And they noticed that people who've experienced these ACEs have higher incidences of physical health issues. And it tends to be an accumulating effect. So if you've experienced 3, you are at higher risk than a person who experienced 2. And if you experience 4, you're at a greater risk than someone who's experienced 3, and so on and so forth, right? And well, no, I won't get into. I'm pretty sure you've already heard about ACEs a number of times in this discussion, because it's kind of a buzzword these days. But if you've not seen Nadine Burke Harris TED Talk on ACEs, I highly recommend it. Again, Dr. Nadine Burke Harris, her TED Talk on ACEs, I would highly recommend it. But here recently, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration has come up with a definition for trauma that tends to be more inclusive, and goes beyond just the idea of the adverse childhood experiences. And they talk about individual trauma being a result from an event or a series of events or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as an emotionally harmful, life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on an individual's functioning, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So this relatively new, expanded, official, if you will, definition of trauma, as you can see, really broadens the scope of when we're thinking about trauma beyond some of the limited things that we attended to focus on with ACEs. And I wanted this kind of laying this foundation here, because as we move forward, I really want us to begin to think about ways that we can address trauma and be trauma informed in a very broad sense. You've seen this, or if you've heard this, I'm pretty sure at this point, a number of times, the trauma's impact on the brain. Yes, if you give me, I can see some of y'all give you a thumbs up. Excellent, yes. I'll ask this question. Can y'all see me? Can some of y'all still see me too? Okay, some of you, all right. So just a real quick brain model here. If you use your hand and you make a fist, that being your brain, you take your thumb, pull it in, right? So the base of your brain, the base part here is your, with the reptilian, your brain stem that just deals with the basic body functions and those kinds of things. The middle part of your brain, this is your limbic system, which is your high emotions and your emotions part. And then the lumpy part of your brain here, the cerebral cortex, the neocortex, that's the part that really makes us human. This is where all the executive function, the abstract, the art, the language, all these kind of things that makes us human. And so when we are triggered with stress, we tend to move out of that cortex and tend to operate in this middle part more and more, the high emotions and those emoting. And there is that particular thing of, I'm sure you've heard it a number of times now, the amygdala and the hippocampus that is under normal circumstances, generally responsible for memory, but during stress, it begins to switch its functions to producing cortisol. And that stress prepares your body for right, the stress responses, right? One of which is putting blood into your big muscles. So there's less blood for your brain. It diminishes your ability to feel pain in particular, but feel in general. So all those kinds of things. And I won't, again, I know you discussed this, so, but just setting this up and reminding us some of the concerns around the impacts of stress. So preparing for that flight, fight, freeze. And what was also recognized now is this flock response. And so again, the blood is rushing to your big muscles because either I gotta hit this thing, I gotta fight it, or I gotta run from it. So there's less oxygen, there's less blood available for the higher functions. One of the reasons why, if it happens so quickly, you quite literally can pass out. You see people faint because the blood is rushing out of their head. But there's also this social response because we are social beings and we know that there's strength in numbers. And so you see this idea of flocking, where when I'm seeing someone or I feel threatened, I look for the group and create this group response. But the chronic, ongoing stress of trauma will diminish concentration, will diminish memory, and also will diminish the organizational and language abilities. One of the things I've stressed with teachers in time past is that, when you are dealing with particularly students who may be having high levels of stress, high level of trauma, and you approach them, coming in, charging in, you quite literally can raise their level of cortisol, where you will become Charlie Brown's teacher. And all they hear is wah, 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 wah. And even when they want to follow directions, it's almost impossible. And so we have to understand how this triggers. But at the end of the day, what makes trauma traumatic? And here's where we're going to take a little bit of a turn. Because I know we often talk about trauma in terms of these events. We talk about trauma in terms of how it impacts the brain. I want to unpack just for a little bit, what makes trauma traumatic? So here's a thought experiment. A small dog just enters the room. How do you respond? Feel free to just put something in the chat. Small dog walks into the room. How do you respond? Pet it. I'll say, oh, how cute. You'll be surprised. Sure. Okay. Want to greet it, pick it up? Okay. All right. Let me ask you this. A tiger comes into the room. How do you respond? Are you petting it? You picking it up? You're running? Run. Okay.
Yeah.
Connie, or do you want to greet it and pet it? Right. Run like H. Okay, I hear you. All right. Now the question is, what's the difference? What is the difference? Fear. What else? What's the difference? The size. Okay. What else? Power. Uh-huh. You know that a tiger can maul you and eat you, right, for dinner, right? Right. One is a pet, one is a pet. Okay, right. So, sense of harm. So at the end of the day, what makes trauma traumatic? I would argue, I'm posing to you, are these four basic things. What makes trauma traumatic is one sense of lack of power. And I put in parentheses privilege, because even if I think that I can do something, I may not, quote unquote, be allowed to do it. And that will raise my level of stress. Lack of skill and knowledge. Now, if I told you, oh, on next Monday, I'm going to bring a tiger down to San Run. Are you traumatized? Probably not. Why? Because one, predictability. If that's what you're going to do Monday, guess where I'm not going to be Monday? I have a strategy for it, right? And again, the sense of harm. A dog, small dog, yap at my ankles, no real big deal. A tiger, somebody said, maul, eat you. Whole different level of sense of harm. So when we talk about what makes trauma traumatic, it tends to be these four things. One's sense of one's ability, power, and the permission to exercise that power. Having a strategy, the skills to understand how to deal and cope with a situation. The predictability of the situation. And the sense of harm of this experience. So moving forward, as we're thinking about what trauma is, and then how we get to that pathway of healing, my strong conjecture is going to be that we have to address issues of power and privilege. We have to address issues of skills and coping strategies concerned with predictability, my ability to think and to predict what might happen. And then also, what is the sense of harm and what is the actual harm being done, right? And so moving forward. So these are the things that make trauma traumatic. Then the next question is, what does it look like in a learning environment, particularly as we are considering this? And again, these four things. How are we addressing issues of power and privilege within the school and the classroom? How are we addressing skill and knowledge? How are we providing security, resources, predictability in the classroom? And how do we create safe places in the classroom? Julian Bond once said, violence is Black children going to school for 12 years and receiving 6 years worth of education. And if you go back to what the definition was, Sam's definition, an event, a series of events, a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as emotionally harmful or life-threatening, that has lasting adverse effects on the individual, functioning, mental, physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. So again, I'm trying to push our understanding as we've established this understanding of what trauma is and how it can be experienced. And again, what we tend to come to are some of those life events and those things of abuse, and we kind of associate with those people, for lack of a better word. Sometimes we also should think about trauma in the context of systemic, institutionalized experiences as well. And those institutionalized experiences that has reduced an individual's or a group's sense of power, that has not provided the skills necessary to exercise my own agency, that has reduced stability of situations for me or a neighborhood, and has produced harm, are also traumatic. Okay. So moving forward, what is the cure for trauma? what is the cure for trauma? The only way for a person to exit trauma is to experience a situation that affirms, recognizes, celebrates their humanity. The only way for a person to exit trauma is to feel safe. I'll ask you, where do you feel most safe? Where do you feel most like a human being? And in most cases, I understand there's always certain situations, but we are most human sitting around a hearth of some sort, a fire, sharing food, telling stories with people who know us. That's when we're most human and where we tend to feel most safe. So how do we utilize that in creating safe, learning, supportive, nurturing environments? Safe environments are places where the human, the self, is acknowledged, where you know that you are seen. If you're familiar with the Avatar movie, and their greeting was, "I see you." And it wasn't just, I'm looking at your physical self. It is, I see who you are as a person, as the essence of you, right? I see you. You're heard. Your stories matter. You're protected. You are valued. You're included. You belong. And this, the word for this is Ubuntu. And there's a whole discussion here we can have on that, but it's an excellent concept. Most simply put is, I am because we are because I am. But this notion of Ubuntu, our individual humanity is tied to our shared humanity. So strategies to create a human-centered, healing, learning environment. I just want to spend some time here. Let's spend some time here. So I'm a fan of Dr. Asa Hilliard, and because over the many years that I've been involved with this kind of work, I think he says it succinctly and says it best. I've never encountered any children in any group who are not geniuses. There's no mystery on how to teach them. The first thing you do is treat them like human beings. And the second thing you do is love them. Now, all too often, this has confused educators that I've encountered. We have taken what is called a modern approach to education, though that has been challenged from the 1930s moving forward, and still has been challenged. It's still a challenge. But here recently, over the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a growing recognition of the importance of social emotional learning in particular. And so in 2019, the Nation at Hope report was released, and it recognized one of its primary findings is children learn best when we treat them as human beings. As one teacher put it, I don't teach math, I teach kids math. To reach a child's mind, we must be concerned for the whole child. Ohio, over the last few years, has adopted social emotional learning standards. This past fall, has adopted a whole child framework to help with this construct and this understanding. Unfortunately, however, education tends to move like a battleship. It takes a long time to move, and teacher preparation is even slower than that. So, but I just wanted to kind of set this stage as we'll start asking you some questions about how do we create a human-centered, healing-centered, nurturing learning environment. So when we talk about a trauma-sensitive classroom, at the center of that is the teacher. At the center of that is the adult, the adult and the professional in the room, right? But the adult is has to manage, interact, facilitate at least these 4 aspects of the classroom. And ideally, they'll be seen as things that support one another and not siloed in here's safety. Now I'll do my connection thing. We'll do some social emotional learning, and then we'll do the academics. One of my pet peeves is when they talk about social emotional learning as a soft skill. It's not a soft skill. It is the foundation upon which learning takes place. It is as essential as anything. And arguably, I'm sorry, I'm about to get on my soapbox, but since I started, I'll say it. That human development is the purpose of education. Reading, math, and all these other things are various tools for human development. But human development is the essential criterion for a quality education. Okay. So what does a trauma-sensitive, a trauma-informed teacher to create a trauma-sensitive classroom in which the impacts of trauma can be reduced, and you create the foundations to increase achievement and learning, right? So if traumatic is lack of power, privilege, lack of skills, knowledge, lack of predictability, and lack of sense of safety, then healing is creating opportunities for choice. And with choice, there's power and privilege, right? I can make a choice and I have the permission to make that choice. That's power and privilege. We're discussing skills. So even when I was teaching math, one of my things I tell my students all day, I can care less that X equals 1. That's the least important thing. But your ability to think through a problem, your ability to practice understanding what's missing and ask the right type of questions, that's the purpose of math, right? That's the skill that's necessary. Who cares that X equals 1? Who cares if a bus leaves Chicago and another bus leaves Detroit? And, that's not important. But your ability to think through a problem. So when a person walks up, hey, baby girl, I got this. You can, let me ask this question. What's missing? What's not being said? And then be able to ask the question. Now that's what's important about math. That's about the importance of knowing the scientific method and reasoning and those kinds of things, right? Predictability and safety. And when we think about safety, We're not just talking about safety in terms of physical, but the emotional as well. How do we discuss ideas and not people? How is it that we protect that you can make a mistake and not lose it all, right? So all of that. And this is always a tricky thing. Understanding that we are working with, how do we do things with students and with each other, and not do things to students in particular. Emphasizing the with and the power sharing that goes along with that. And so addressing these principles of safety, trustworthiness, and transparency, empowerment, voice and choice, collaborative, mutually sharing relationships, that power dynamic that goes along with that, understanding everything is in a cultural, historical, gender as well, context, and how do we elicit that peer support, one from another, that group. So as you are being asked to think about developing your trauma-informed human engagement plan, moving away, because all too often, particularly in schools, the thought is, how do we reduce harm? How do we reduce violence? And move towards, how do we create safe, nurturing environments? Or as one person has told me, the absence of violence is not necessarily the presence of safety. Just because we remove the harm doesn't necessarily mean that we brought the good. And how do we purposely move towards good? And there's some folks that have provided some thoughts to that. Here's some quick do's and don'ts for a trauma-informed, compassionate classroom. Create a safe space. Again, not only just the physical, but the emotional safety as well. Providing opportunity to build that emotional literacy. Because if I can be able to speak what I'm feeling, I'm less likely to act it out, right? Establish predictability. Build a sense of trust. Offer choices. Stay regulated. And that's particularly for the adults, right? It's hard for me I should not be screaming, be quiet. That's a contradiction, right? I need to be able to model the behavior that I'm expecting. And one of my other pet peeves is understand the difference between, we talk about don't punish, because we will use punish, discipline, consequences as if they all mean the same thing. And they're distinctly different. They're distinctly different. Know the difference. Sean Ginwright talks about creating healing-centered environments, restoring identity by practicing hope, empathy, reflection, particularly in these dimensions of identity, culture, agency, relationships, meaning, aspirations. CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. They recently just, again, came out with the transformative SEL, transformative social and emotional framework, where the competencies of social self-awareness, self-management, responsible decision-making, social awareness, and relationship skills are used as a lever to empower young people and adults to co-create, again, that collaborative work, thriving schools that contribute to safe, healthy, just communities by supporting, nurturing identity, agency, and that sense of belonging. So these are a couple of different approaches that people can use. We believe that we can use to address this. But I go back to Asa Hilliard. And this is what I use when engaging teachers around this subject. There's no mystery how to teach them. First thing you do is treat them like human beings. Second thing you do is love them. So the question becomes, how do you treat students like human beings? To ask that very direct question. And ideally as a teacher, or if you're supporting a school, if you're interested in this kind of work with schools, to be able to answer this question, how do you treat your students like human beings? They have very specific answers to that. What does love look like in your classroom? And unfortunately, I've had too many times where I would ask that particular question and I have a teacher fold their arms and get downright mad that I would dare ask them, what does love look like in their classroom? More often than not, though, some of our very best teachers, it's not this quite, they practice these things, but it's not quite framed in a way. And so I just wanted to bring it up to attention. If you are I'm tech savvy, if this QR code that's on the screen, if you go to that, there's these worksheets that you see on the screen are available, and you can look at a filled out example that has been done. But what does love look like? I will just kind of give you one thing that I use that I found to be very useful. Love is kind. Love is not rude. Love endures all. Love hopes all things. So the question then becomes, how do you manifest that in your classroom? How do you manifest not being rude in your classroom? How do you manifest kindness in your classroom? How do you manifest perseverance in your classroom? These are just some ways of thinking about it. So with that, here's some resources that's available. I have to admit, as I was putting this together and I was just trying to squeeze all this in, I created the trauma and learning just today. So there's just something that says available, and I will I'll backfill it in with some of the information that I have here. If you go to successfulacademics.com/equity guides, there's a list of resources there around equity and anti-racism and some other resources that I think is related there. And then if you go to successfulacademics.com, Black Child SEL, there's a whole list of resources there around narrative, the transformative social emotional learning model. The Nation at Risk report is available at nationathope.org, nationathope.org. Another excellent resource, again, about understanding that safety and moving forward, being proactive, peace literacy is a phenomenal piece there. And then Castle as a resource that's available there. Thank you for your time. If you want more information about me, I'm available. You can find information about me at Dr. Goggins, dr.goggins2.com. I thank you for this time, and I appreciate. I'm looking forward to your questions and answers. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Goggins, for just an inspiring